In an obscure exercise of alternate propulsion for British locomotives, the English Electric GT3 proposed the use of gas turbines as a means of driving future forms of UK traction, presenting to the network a very short-lived and unusual design that appeared from the outside to be simply a squared-off steam engine. The origins of the GT3 date back to even before World War II, where during the 1930s, the Big Four railway companies identified ways of replacing steam locomotives en masse due to their poor efficiency, low availability, and high labour costs, with developments beginning as to more economical forms of propulsion for rolling stock. Alternatives ultimately came down to two initial concepts: electrification, as adopted as a widespread method by the Southern Railway, and to lesser extents the LMS and LNER, and diesel traction, which was taken on to varying degrees by all four companies, though due to the heavy capital cost of electrification and the lack of suitable engines in the high horsepower ranges for diesels, meant these proposals were very limited in their application prior to the war. With the conflict of 1939 to 1945 diverting the attention of the railways, little progress was made on alternative propulsion concepts until the late 1940s, when concerted efforts were made to examine new traction that would take the railway forward into a new era, which led the newly formed British Railways, as nationalised in 1948, to follow two trains of thought as inherited from the preceding Big Four during their twilight years. The first, which was adopted by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway and the Southern Railway, was to rely on diesel traction, though this was again hampered by the available power units, which had a poor power-to-weight ratio, and thus required early locomotives to work in multiple on express and heavier duties. The second, which found favour with the Great Western Railway, was to use a gas turbine power unit to drive an electrical transmission, producing a very powerful if not very economical locomotive, a bold move by the railway firm, given the fact that gas turbines had only recently been proven in military applications. However, English Electric, which had a considerable investment in diesels, also wished to explore this alternative avenue, leading chief designer J.O.P. Hughes to begin early proposals, with work starting on this project as early as 1946, various concept drawings eventually being produced, some of which showed a design with box wheels, as used by Bulliard, and others which were labelled 19,000 Lord of the Isles. Hughes thought that the concept had the best chance of being successful if it was based around as much conventional technology as possible, and thus he eschewed the idea of adopting a diesel-type chassis with electric transmission, instead opting for a steam outline configuration, which looked much like a 460 mixed-traffic engine, complete with tender, the latter aspect being used to house fuel, water and steam heating equipment for the coaching stock. The proposed locomotive was centred around the company's EM27 gas turbine unit, capable of providing 2,750 horsepower, and would be mounted roughly where the locomotive's boiler would have been, this unit directly driving a gearbox that provided power to the centre driving axle via a flexible drive, with power being transmitted to the other driving wheels via outside coupling rods as per steam locomotives. Two turbines would ultimately be fitted, with the low-pressure one running continuously and providing power for the auxiliary functions, while the high-pressure turbine provided propulsion power, at the front of which, where the smoke box would usually be, being a compartment that contained a number of belt-driven machines, while the tender contained the steam heating boiler as well as a crew toilet and a corridor which enabled personnel to enter and leave the cab while the train was in motion. Progress on developing the gas turbine locomotive was a protracted process due to the priorities of the British Railways management, and after nearly 15 years of work, the first prototype would eventually emerge onto the network during 1959, by which time its steam locomotive-derived chassis design was somewhat outdated, the new machine being numbered GT3 or Gas Turbine 3, presumably in homage to the two Great Western gas turbine locomotives which had preceded it into traffic. Upon rollout, the GT3 was lacking its external cladding and tender, although it was otherwise complete, and in this state it was taken to the British Railways test house at Rugby, where it was the first non-steam engine to be put on the rollers, the locomotive also being subject to some tests on a severely graded and curved test track, where it proved capable of moving two LMS 280s in extreme circumstances. There still did not appear to be a rush with the project though, and it was to be another 11 months before GT3 was returned to English Electric for bodywork fitment and the addition of the tender, work which again took some time, meaning that it wouldn't be until 1961 before the completed engine was ready for mainline trials. Work began on the Shropshire lines from Crewe on January 9, 1961, and mainly involved runs from Crewe to Whitchurch and Chester light engine, followed by some loaded test runs to Llandudno Junction, this being followed by a move to Leicester for empty stock haulage between there and London Marylebone, during which some issues with the reversing gear became apparent, which required amendment. During this period, the engine was inspected by the Duke of Edinburgh when he visited an Institute of Locomotive Engineers exhibition at Marylebone, while further tests followed on the Great Central Main Line with a dynamometer car and a rake of former LMS coaches, which lasted until September of that year. In October, GT3 was moved back to Crewe, where it was trialled on the West Coast Main Line to Carlisle, being capable of achieving some outstanding performance as it hauled 12 coaches from a standing start at T-Bay to a 44-mile-an-hour top speed by the time it reached the top of the arduous Shap summit, a feat impossible during the days of steam, and one that was even a challenge to contemporary diesels, this feat later being replicated, but with an additional 4 coaches. Performance at all times was considered to be very good, and of interest with respect to a prototype locomotive was that reliability was also excellent, with GT3 not once failing to complete a booked turn once it had left the shed, one major advantage of the engine over a steam equivalent being its startup time, which was as little as 100 seconds and utilized a battery and starter motor to power the turbine. The prototype also garnered high praise from engine crews, who considered it relatively easy to drive, as was the comfort of the fully enclosed cab, which was kept in an immaculate state by the test crews and which was, famously, fully carpeted throughout. Despite the successes of the trials, GT3 was dispatched back to its manufacturer in 1962, having never worked a revenue-earning train, this being a disappointment to English Electric, which had hoped to be able to supply more of the class, but in reality the chassis design was completely outdated, and the concept would have required a complete rework if a production series of locomotives was ever to be considered. On a positive note, the engine had proven that gas turbine propulsion in rail applications was capable of high power outputs for long periods of time, but on the negative side suffered from the fact that the unit was designed to work consistently at high output for long periods, rather than having cyclic demand as per usual railway work, resulting in significant fuel inefficiency, a matter that to this day continues to go unresolved. Back at the Vulcan foundry, there was little enthusiasm for developing the concept further, though no firm decision was made as to GT3's future, thus leading to it being sheeted up in one of the workshops, where it would remain for another 4 years until rediscovered by journalists during a press visit, after which sensationalist headlines were run that embarrassed the English Electric management. As a result, GT3 was taken back into the works, where its turbine and power equipment was removed for reuse elsewhere, while the remainder of the locomotive was dragged to wards of Sheffield for scrapping, arriving there in February 1966, its transfer move being ironically conducted by one of the steam locomotives it was intending to replace. To summarize, GT3, in practice, was an extremely successful locomotive, though due to a lack of enthusiasm by the British Railways management and the amount of time taken to develop the machine, diesel traction had already taken hold of the wider fleet rosters of the UK network by the time this machine appeared in its completed form during 1961, meaning that the resultant prototype with its unusual single-cab tender design proved to be nothing more than an oddity within the ranks of the company. However, despite its extremely short lifespan, GT3, with its striking brown livery, was able to receive significant praise for its performance, style, and driving manners, with questions still being raised to this day as to whether this unusual-looking engine might have fared a greater chance against the diesels had it been delivered in the late 1940s, thus presenting a more viable alternative to steam traction than its internal combustion rivals.